Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being with us today. My name is Danielle Lund, and I serve as Associate Director of Digital Engagement for Mount Holyoke's Alumni Association. Our work at the Alumni Association is all about providing opportunities for alums to connect with one another and back to the college. Registered for today's webinar are 100 alums and students spanning 8 decades, from the classes of 1953 all the way up to the class of 2024. So again, welcome and thank you for being with us today. For those who weren't able to join at this time, we're going to be providing a recording for viewing after the event. Over the past year, we've been focusing on industry-specific events like this one, and we'll be continuing to expand our offering. So we'd encourage you, we'll have a survey after the event, so please take a minute to just fill that out, share your thoughts on the event and your ideas and hopes for future events with the Mount Holyoke Law community. It's great to be here virtually with Danetta Beaushaw, class of '88, a strategic legal consultant practicing in the Houston, Texas area, who will moderate discussion with Ellen Cosgrove, class of '84, associate dean at Yale Law School, and Markeisha Miner, class of '99, dean of students at Cornell Law School. For participants, if you have questions along the way, please include in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that and focusing on the questions at the close of the formal moderated discussion. So Danetta, Ellen, and Markeisha, thank you for being with us. I'm now going to turn things over to you.
Hi, everybody. I am Danetta Beaushaw, class of 1988. And I'm so pleased that we're able to do this program today. Markeisha and Ellen are two of my favorite human beings. I think one of the great, the most amazing evidence of what we all know to be true, that Mount Holyoke has an amazing community for its students, is that we have a group of alums who have gone on to be the dean of students at really elite institutions. And these two are two of our rock stars, so I'm so pleased that they could join us today. I'd like to just kick it off by noting that I think when many alums talk to recent alums and to students, some of the advice we give is that it is fine to have plans, but that most of us have careers that have taken a circuitous path that we never dreamed of, and to be open to the opportunities. So I thought it would be really good to start off by allowing Ellen and then Markeisha to orient us to the pathways that their careers took. So Ellen, would you like to start and give us an overview?
Sure. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you about this terrific profession. So as Danetta said, I graduated in 1984. And at the time, banking seemed to be the very hot career path that a lot of my classmates were following. So I actually worked with the Career Services Office at Mount Holyoke, got a job working in New York for a large investment bank, hated it. I love the people that I worked with. I love the excitement of being sort of in the center of New York City, in the center of the world of finance. But what I found talking to my colleagues is that I wasn't passionate about what I was doing. And a lot of them were. And they would talk about articles they read over the weekend that were just fascinating, you know, about how deals were being structured. And I thought, I don't find that fascinating. That's work. And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I'm never going to succeed in a career where I don't really have passion. And so as I started to think about the things that got me very excited, I thought back to a class I took with Chris Pyle at Mount Holyoke and realized I really loved all things related to law. When I was reading the newspaper, I was excited reading about cases. And so I decided that I was going to make the switch to law school, which I did 4 years after graduation, and highly recommend taking time away. So that's going to be later on in the conversation. I went to law school. I practiced at a large firm in New York for 4 years. I liked the work that I did very much, but again, I didn't feel like I had the passion for what I was doing. So I had to start thinking again about what it is that I might want to do. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the work I did at Mount Holyoke and the work that I did at my law school, being very involved in the interaction between students and faculty and administrators. And so I started to move in that direction. So I became a law school administrator 26 years ago, finally found my passion, and I've stuck with it.
Right, Markeisha, would you like to take us on your path?
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just thrilled to be here with all of you listening in, but also with great colleagues, friends, mentors, Ellen and Danetta. Mount Holyoke is just full of all sorts of gifts. And the one that I've been most surprised by is just the generosity of my fellow alum who have poured so much into me and who I have the joy of being on this journey as a lawyer with as well, and now with Ellen as a law school administrator. So I graduated in 1999 and have the great fortune to be the president of that mighty yellow sphinx of a class. After, I knew I always wanted to go to law school, but I had a great debate with myself as a senior about whether or not to pursue a PhD in African and African American studies or to go to law school. And so I ultimately decided to go to law school. And I knew after having gone to Holyoke, first time I really ever spent any time away from home, that I wanted to go back home. And home for me is Detroit, Michigan. And so I went back home to a great law school that I share with Danetta as a fellow alum to the University of Michigan. And I also knew that I wanted to stay home and be a part of Detroit's resurgence. But to Danetta's point about not knowing where the path may lead, but going where there is no path and blazing your own, I had applied to be a judicial law clerk as a second-year student. That didn't work out. And then as a third-year student, I was very actively involved in the Black Law Student Association, and we got a call that a judge in Detroit was looking for a clerk. And this was a week before graduation from law school. So I ended up starting my legal career clerking for the Honorable Anna Diggs Taylor in Detroit, who's also a women's college graduate. She's a graduate of Barnard. And an alum of Ellen's current employer for law school. And so after working with the judge, I went back to the large law firm in Detroit that I had been a summer associate at. I had also been a summer my first year in Chicago. And while I liked it, to Ellen's point, I just wasn't passionate. I love Chicago, but I wasn't passionate about practicing there. But while I was practicing, I enjoyed the perks and the privileges of being a practitioner, but wasn't really passionate about representing large corporations as a litigator. It wasn't the sort of work I thought I would be doing as a little girl when I dreamed of growing up to be a lawyer. It wasn't the sort of work that I had seen in the courtroom with the judge as her clerk. And so a law school professor said, "Hey, are you still looking to do something different?" And I said, "Well, what you got?" And she said, "Well, the dean at the law school down the street is looking for an administrator in career services." And she said, "I think the things you've done throughout law school would make you a good fit." That was a dozen years ago, come August, and I've not looked back.
Thank you guys so much. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what law school is really like. And my guess is it's a little bit different than when I attended. So first of all, let me get the anxiety question out of the way, particularly for those who might be introverts like I was. I think when I was thinking about law school, even after being very self-confident at Mount Holyoke, I was an introvert. So the idea of sitting in a classroom of 200 people and dealing with the Socratic method intimidated me a bit. Yeah. So would you both like to talk a little bit about the benefits of the various teaching styles that are used in law school and how to make the best of those different approaches? Ellen, would you like to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I went back, I guess Danetta and I were in law school around the same time, late 80s. And the number of women in my law school class was between a quarter and a third. So it was such a different experience to my Mount Holyoke experience. But the one thing I will tell you that really made me proud is that I brought the confidence of Mount Holyoke with me into the classroom. So I was somebody who volunteered in class. So a lot of times people wait just to be called on. They're very passive. But people start to be noticed for whether or not they're people who are willing to engage in the classroom conversation. And one day, one of the men in our class said, you know, there's been a lot of studies about how women versus men will participate in class. And he noted that there were about 5 women in our class who were really active participators. Every single one was a women's college graduate. And that's no mistake. And so we started talking about it as a group. You know, we just felt like we were supposed to be at the table. We were supposed to be talking up. This was part of our job. And so I credit Mount Holyoke with giving me the confidence to take part in it. That said, there are a lot of studies that talk about the fact that the Socratic method is very challenging for students. It can be particularly intimidating to students based on gender, based on race and ethnicity, based on whether or not they're first gen in their family to go to graduate school. And I think over the last 20, 30 years, faculty have become much more sensitive to that. So you see that faculty members are looking for ways to expand teaching beyond just traditional Socratic method, which is essentially the entire way I did law school. So what you find are many more seminars, many more opportunities where the faculty members will call on students in panels or things so that the students know in advance that they're going to be on call on a certain day and not on other days, which allows them to relax if this is causing a lot of stress. I have students that come to me all the time that are dealing with particular issues, either a really challenging family situation or personal anxiety, and then I'll work with the faculty member and the student to kind of make sure that we're taking care of the student going through the process. So I think you should expect that any law school you're going to these days is going to offer a variety of classroom instruction. It's why visiting schools at a time where maybe we're able to visit schools again, I think is very important to kind of get a sense of what the classroom dynamic is. Are people really engaged or are people checked out? But it will be a combination of experiences, but the more you can push yourself to be engaged in a classroom when you're in law school and there are no stakes, even though it feels like stakes because no one wants to look foolish, there really are no stakes. The first time I stood up in a courtroom was terrifying. And the fact that I was able to speak in front of 200 classmates and do it with confidence gave me the confidence that I needed in court. So I think it's kind of a necessary part of the process to take you to the next stage in our profession. So,
Yeah.
Markeisha?
Yeah, similarly, I was quite intimidated by the Socratic method, but also challenged and engaged by it, right? My challenge in transitioning from Mount Holyoke to law school was I was used to being surrounded by very brilliant people, all of whom happened to be women. And so when people spoke up in class, it was because they had something to add to the conversation. And so I certainly remember being like, well, if I'm not talking, it's because I don't have anything to add or anything to say. And when I say something, it's going to matter, right? And not having that same impression of some of my male classmates. So, we call them gunners in law school, the folks who are raising their hand just to fill the room with their voice. And I was so annoyed by that. Like, dude, you're talking, but you're not saying anything, and can you hush so the rest of us can learn from one another? And so, that took a bit of an adjustment. And I've spoken or written before at Mount Holyoke Publications about needing to find my own voice again, because Mount Holyoke gave me that gift of finding my voice. And I was a little thrown in law school because I didn't know quite how and where and when to jump in, except when I was called on. And so I encourage my students if you have something to say, to speak up and say it, to make space, take space, but make space as well for yourself. I tended to thrive more when I found the clinical courses. It was my clinic professor that said, hey, the dean of the school down the street has an opening. Because I was passionate about the work. I've worked in a law clinic that served community development corporations in Detroit. So it was my home community, and I could see how the theory and the doctrine that I was learning in the classroom connected to the sort of work I had envisioned doing. And in seminar classes as well, which were a bit smaller, and you could engage with the material a bit more directly than you could in a large lecture hall. And as Ellen said, there are many more opportunities for that. Legal education has changed so much, even since the late 90s when I was in school after the downturn of 2001, 2002, when I graduated. Things have, I think, we're so much more of a student-centered educational experience, and there are many more ways to find oneself in the curriculum, many more experiential learning classes where you're not just talking or being questioned, but also doing and having a chance to try that out in lots of different types of settings. But I'm a litigator, or a recovering litigator, I say. So I knew I wanted to be a corporate room lawyer. And even though I didn't fully appreciate it at the time, I knew I needed to push myself out of my comfort zone and allow myself to receive the benefits and the burdens of the Socratic method. And certainly in hindsight, both as a litigator and now, even in my work now in legal education, there are many times I'm called on in a meeting where, you know, I can deliver an answer, or even if I haven't thought about it thoroughly before, and my law school training prepared me for that.
Wonderful. So you both have had such extraordinary careers. Between the two of you, you've had Dean of Students positions at Cornell, University of Chicago, Harvard, and Yale. And you've done this at a time when I believe law school and students were changing rapidly. So two questions for you both. How have you seen your students change over time? And how have the services that you offer as a Dean of Students, how have those changed over time to respond to your students?
Mm-hmm.
Markeisha,
So Markeisha, would you like to take it first?
Sure. I started in this work in 2008, in August of 2008. And for many of you, that date may not mean anything, but for others, it may mean quite a bit. So I started 1 month before Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers collapsed. And I was the Dean of Career Services at the time, so the person charged with helping students find employment. And in Detroit at that time, I was at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. So the heart of the auto industry, which had just started experiencing the collapse about a year or so before. So I thought, left a law firm about not quite a year before I would have been up for partner, and started in career services a month before the financial world changes. I have impeccable timing, right? But in that time, so students had to, and we as well as the folks who supported them, had to adapt quite quickly, right? So my students had often been older at that institution, had often juggled other work in school. So that transition, while jarring, was not entirely foreign to them. They were quite resilient and had to build up resilience quickly. And so we were all working through it together and relying on our alum and practitioner peers and colleagues to be much more intentional about how we were going to use this legal training, both that we were providing and that they were receiving. And so over time, I've seen law students become, or legal education become, not just a place where one sort of waits it out and figures out what one wants to do next, but that one enters a bit more determined and intentional about how one plans to use the degree. But legal education in that time has shifted. So when I was a law student, there was a bit of a sink or swim mentality, I think. You either knew it or you didn't. You knew how to navigate the space or you didn't. And in 2008, my students seemed to be much more independent and much more willing and able to navigate the space. Being in student services over the last dozen years, students are independent and are willing to navigate the space, but I believe look to law schools for a lot more support as they navigate that space, and a lot more direction. And that's been a privilege to provide, but it is interesting to compare the two groups of students. And I do encourage my students in this moment to look to and learn from their future peers and future colleagues who navigated that transition of 2008, 2011, because I think their resilience, the grit, the grace that they exhibited hold a lot of lessons for students navigating this time. Ellen?
So ditto to everything Markeisha just said. I think you said that beautifully. Since I can go back farther, you know, over 26 years, I'd say it's changed a lot. It was very white. It was very male. It was very straight. It was cis. It was upper middle class. That's a much less complicated community to work with. And so what's happened over time is as we've gotten increasingly diverse, we've had to be responsive to that. And it doesn't always happen necessarily at the faculty level. So the administrators, you know, get involved. It's very different to be a student who's just struggling with exams or the Socratic method than if you're also a student who's dealing with really significant family obligations, really significant financial constraints, serious illnesses, things like that. So the issues that I spend the most time on now were barely on my radar screen when I first entered this field. So I spend most of my time working on mental health and wellness issues for our students. There's a lot of studies out there. You can actually go to the American Bar Association, has a section of their website that's devoted to mental health and wellness and provides some information. But essentially, it's the law doesn't come out well in terms of mental health and wellness. It's a very high stress profession. Probably it attracts a lot of type A personalities, which adds to that. But it is also a profession that puts a fair amount of stress on its participants. So we spend a lot of time working with students from the get-go, trying to teach basic kind of wellness and thriving strategies to get people not only through law school, but then into their career. We spend an enormous amount of time right now working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the issues we're going to talk about in the classroom are so different from issues you might be talking about in another kind of graduate school program. And while you might sit there and say, this is an interesting intellectual exercise, the person sitting next to you says, my safety, my dignity, my life depends on this. And so trying to really sensitize people to what it means to be engaging on really hard issues like this in a way that you really are delving deeply into the issues, but you're also being really respectful to who's in the room and how this is impacting people. So we spend a lot of time on that with our students. I'm the Title IX coordinator at the law school. We spend an enormous amount of time on Title IX issues, not because more things are happening now. In fact, I think far fewer things are happening now than were back when I was in law school. But back then nobody talked about them or did anything about them. Those changes started in the mid 90s, and so we spent a lot of time talking to our students about all the different ways that things can happen. So our clinics, for instance, 2 years ago, students noticed that it tended to be the female identified students in class who were reserving rooms or ordering food or doing things that might traditionally be considered secretarial work. And it was just happening because someone had to do it and people were willing to jump in. But things like that, trying to sensitize people that from the tiniest little examples to really enormous examples, this stuff really matters. So those are things that that take a lot of time. And finally, I mentioned first gen students before. So the number of first gen students in college and in law school has really exploded in the last 10 or so years. And I think schools are really trying to catch up. What does that mean for mentors? You know, we don't expect that a student is coming in and they have parents who are lawyers who can connect them to their friends for summer jobs. So how do we connect our students to alums so that the students are able to get meaningful advice as they start to embark on their career? So the entire population has really changed, and I think we've been working very hard to change with it.
Yeah, that's great. One thing that was remarkable to me as a young lawyer, I started my career out in California, was even back in the early 90s, the California bar recognized that wellness and diversity and bias were big issues for the profession. And out there, even to keep your license, you had to take a continuing legal education class in elimination of bias and prevention of substance abuse, because it was such a big issue for those of us in the profession. So it's always I think it's good to look at the pressure of law school as a time to really establish those good habits that will get you through a lifetime of a very stressful career. So what advice would you give someone who is entering law school, they're in their first semester, you know, how do they set themselves up for success? Jump in.
You know, I would say, I would echo something Ellen said earlier, which is follow your passion and everything else will fall into place, right? So, and this may go to another question, Danetta, that we may or may not get to. But I think the first question is whether or not law school is for you, right? And being really honest with yourself about, is this the place that I want and need to be at this particular time in my life, right?
Yeah, and feel free to go ahead and talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily mean law school isn't for you, but is it for you right now, given what you have going on, and whatever that might be? And if the answer is yes, then, you know, jump in both feet, embrace and enjoy the journey, and immerse yourself into the experience, right? Because law school, it can be all consuming. It doesn't have to be all consuming, but it should, you know, involve every single part of you. And, you know, to our earlier discussion about balance is important. And so, you know, maintaining your relationships with the folks you love and who support you is critical. And that's a lifelong and career-long skill that you'll need to manage and learn and adjust as you go. But your studies, particularly in the first year, will require quite a bit if you want to master law study and to do it well. So first, establish that firm foundation of who are my support team members, you know, who is my board of advisors, get those folks in place, consult them often, and set up your schedule. You have to be really intentional. Again, the law can be all consuming, so it's up to you to direct your law school studies and your legal career the way you want it to go. And so for me, I have gone to church every single Sunday of my life. I'm Baptist, so that means I'm in church half the doggone day, right? I couldn't do all of that in law school, but I wasn't going to give up going to church. So Sunday morning is my sacred time, right? So you have to carve out those blocks of time and those activities that matter to you most. I also happen to love football, particularly in particular yellow and blue team. But in law school, I couldn't, you know, engage and indulge my football life as much as I wanted to, or as much as I can now. Now that I'm not a first-year law student or a first-year associate anymore. So you do have to make some informed choices as well, right? So follow your passion, get your support system in place, and establish some solid structures and schedules so that you can manage both your priorities, your studies, but also your preferences, the things that you like and that help you enjoy life.
I agree completely. I think for me, there's a bit of a sliding scale as you think about how you're going to approach law school. So it's unfair, but I think in terms of being realistic, the more competitive a law school you go to, the less your grades are going to matter. So I talk to people who've been to pretty much every law school in the country, and there's a lot of places where students feel like unless they graduate in the top 10% of the class, most job opportunities won't be available to them. when you get into sort of what's considered the more elite law schools, that's not the case, but students still manage to stress themselves out, because then they say, oh, I need to get a Supreme Court clerkship, you know, and there's only 36 of those a year, and things like that. So what I'll say to people a lot of time in the first year is, what's your life goal? Because it may be, if you say you want to go back to St. Louis and you want to practice at a medium-sized firm so that you have time for your family, or you want to work for an organization that does impact in a particular area that's really important to you, you're probably going to be able to do that with a wide range of grades coming from a lot of different law schools. And so if that's the case, you really can think more about how to have a really complete law school experience, having time for activities, as well as classes. If you feel like you have to graduate at the tippy top of the class, first year of law school is very important for setting a tone in terms of opportunities that might be available down the road for law review, or opportunities that might be available for some of the most competitive clerkships. And so I'll say to a student, if that's really your goal, then you probably don't want to be getting involved in the extracurricular life at the school as much. That might be something you can start to do during your second and third year after you get this solid foundation of grades in your first year of law school. I sort of took the tack both at Mount Holyoke, and then I went to law school at the University of Chicago, where I kind of thought, oh, phew, I got in. All I have to do now is get out. And that gave me so much flexibility in terms of how I approached it. I will say I reconsidered my Mount Holyoke decision when I came to applying to law schools and thought, oh, I wish I had worked a little bit harder. I used a few more A's, but it's, you know, you do have to really think about what is your goal. But classwork really does matter, particularly in the first year. And if those are the markers that you want to hit, you really want to be more focused on your classes in your first year than you might have been in college.
Great. So what are the biggest mistakes that you see students making? I know that's a really broad question, but if you could steer fellow alums and students away from the pitfalls, what do you see?
A quick anecdote. Last year I was super stressed, and we have all these free classes on our campus. You know, when outside is open, you can go to yoga class. So I hadn't been to yoga since I was at Mount Holyoke. It's an August morning. It's 7 o'clock, which is so not my style, but that's how stressed I was. I went over to yoga at 7, and she said, you know, you're doing really great. And I said, I haven't been in yoga in 20 years. And I was like kind of losing my balance a bit. And she said, when we look to the left or to the right, instead of within ourselves in yoga or in life, that's when we lose our balance. And I thought, whoa, what a life lesson, right? And so for my students, we often see the stumbles, and what I noticed in myself, right? I went to law school. I knew I wanted to be a litigator. I knew I wanted to help my community. Then I get in school, and these large law firms come through. They're the lowest hanging fruit. Their recruitment is easy. They wine, they dine you, and all of a sudden the brass ring changed, right? It wasn't being the community advocate or, you know, whatever that meant to me. It was, I got to work at this firm and make X amount of money and all. I was looking to the left or the right, and I was losing my balance, right? When I worked for the judge, I had loved every single minute. If she would have kept me for 4 years, I would have stayed, right? And so, like Ellen said, figure out what your life goals are and follow that doggedly. That doesn't mean that you're not open to changing directions if something else comes along that really, you know, tickles your fancy or piques your interest. But look into what your classmates are doing can easily get you off balance and off track. And that, frankly, that's where I see a lot of the mental health and wellness issues that I support students through. That's where it comes from more often than not. It's about what my family wants me to do, about what my classmate is doing. And when I ask, like, what did you come to law school to do? It's almost never those things, right? And so you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and that causes a lot of friction and tension. The other mistake I'll say that I made, I did not do well my first year in law school. Right? Certainly my first semester, got the lowest grade I've ever seen in my life, except for high school physics, which you know, I'm not a STEM person, so that doesn't matter. And we do have STEM folks in the law, so you all are welcome. But my mistake was burying my head in the sand because of shame, right? Instead of reaching out and accepting the help that was available. Now, at the time, again, it was a sink or swim culture. Folks weren't shouting from the rooftops, oh, we have tutors, or oh, we have academic support. But those structures and support systems certainly were there. And I just thought, well, I gotta grin and bear it and, you know, just put my nose to the grindstone and I gotta work through this for myself. That was a mistake. There were people there who could have told me what I was doing, not just wrong, but where I could improve and what skills I could strengthen. And so because of that experience, and I finally did get it right, or, you know, find my way, but I wasted way too much time, right? And you pay a lot of money to go to law school, no matter where you go, right? Even if you have a full ride, you're paying a lot of money, you're paying a lot of energy, a lot of effort, investing a lot of time, energy, and effort. So take advantage of the resources are there. When the Dean of Students reaches out, when a student organization says we have this or that support, when an alum takes time to come back to campus and to speak to students, take advantage of that. That's part of the investment you're making, not just in the education, but in yourself. And that ability to reach out and accept help or to ask for it, I think is a demonstration of professional maturity that I encourage all lawyers to exhibit.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on this. Feeling worthy is very difficult for students in law school. And, you know, I've worked at Chicago and Harvard and Yale. So 3 of the top 5 law schools, if you look at those rankings. I will tell you that almost every student I encounter feels unworthy because they will start with where they fell short. And you want to shake people and say, you know, focus on everything that you've done right in your life. And it's just not the mindset of law students. So making yourself feel like this is a place that owes you. You are a student. You are meant to be there. You are entitled to be there. So seek out faculty members. Go to lunch with faculty, have coffee with faculty. If you're not comfortable, I wasn't. I always thought I'm going to go. They're going to want to discuss some obscure case. I'm going to look like a fool, so I'm not going to. But making relationships with faculty members actually winds up being very important. So get 2 of your friends and go to the office together and invite the faculty member out and start developing those mentorships, because in the end, no one's seeking you out to be a mentee. I kind of feel like at Mount Holyoke, that did almost happen. Almost in spite of yourself, people mentored me at Mount Holyoke. But that's not how it happens anywhere else. And you really have to fight for the mentors. And in order to do that, you need to feel worthy. So I think that's big, big, big number 1. The second one, I'm going to go back on something Markeisha started talking about, is the other big mistake I would say people make is going to law school and not knowing why they went to law school. So I've joked that my next career move is to be a dean of students at a medical school, because I don't know anyone who defaults into medical school, but a lot of people default into law school. And so my fall is taken up with students sitting on my couch saying, I'm not sure why I'm here. And when we start talking, it's because, well, I used to like to fight with my kindergarten teacher. She told me I'd be a good lawyer. Or, well, I didn't really want to get a PhD in history because I didn't want to, you know, be relegated to teaching in some Midwestern state that I had never been to before. So I thought law is kind of like history, or law is kind of like politics. So there's so many people that go to law school without a meaningful idea of why they're there. And law school is hard, and law school is, it can be soul sucking. And I think that if you don't have that constant check of, here's why I'm here, this is why I'm doing it, this is my goal, even if you don't know exactly the kind of law you want to practice, that there's sort of a commitment to getting a law degree, that's going to get you through some of the really hard times. One of the exercises we do at orientation is we have students write letters to themselves about why they're in law school, how they chose law school, and then we send it to them, you know, in the middle of their first year when they've kind of lost all hope and abandoned, you know, all sense of why they're here, just to try to lift their spirits a little bit. So you should think about that. If you are interested in law school, write to yourself and tell yourself why, because, you know, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, it might be very helpful to remind yourself of it. Like Markeisha, I went completely off track. I went to law school because I wanted to practice family law. I incurred an enormous amount of debt. I borrowed an enormous amount of money, and I was at a school that didn't have a very generous loan forgiveness program. So all of a sudden I realized I need to go to a large firm because I have to pay off this debt. And I was fortunate to be at a place where large firms came to campus and hired you, and the process was pretty simple. And so I went through that process, wound up working, 24/7, doing corporate deals, which was not at all what I had ever wanted to do in my life. And I think there's so many people who get sucked along that track because they weren't purposeful. There's a great book called Broken Contract by, I think it's Jeffrey Kallenberg, who basically talks about how he went with an idea to getting a public interest job and then got sucked into large law firm life. And I think it's just a very good explanation of how the culture of law school can take you off your chosen track. So keeping true to your track, I think, is also really important.
Okay, great. So let's riff off that a bit. So before we start talking about how to choose a law school, let's talk about considering other options. So in 15 years of doing pre-law advising at Mount Holyoke, sometimes I joke that it's my job to talk people out of law school, not into law school. Is law school even necessary? When is it a good path towards another career, and when would it be best to pursue a different path towards that career? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Yes. Markeisha, you want to go?
Sure, I can start. When I talk to students who are interested in law school, I often start with something completely unrelated, which is, if you had your dream job, and by that I mean if you went to work every day and you came home at the end of the day and you thought that was the best day ever, what would you be doing? What would your office setting look like? Who would you be talking to? What sorts of tasks would you be sitting at a desk? Would you be walking around? Those sorts of things. And sometimes the things folks describe don't look anything like what lawyers in any practice setting or non-practice setting do, right? So case in point, I was talking to a colleague across campus and said, well, I'm interested in law school. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, ideally, they work in admissions right now. Ideally, I would be a person who advocates for historically Black colleges and universities to have the funding that they need, and ultimately would love to be a college president. Okay. So if you want to be a college president, you need a terminal degree. You're probably going to be a scholar. Some college presidents are JDs, are lawyers. Most are not, though, right? So, but starting with, what is it you really want to do? And, he described, I'd be sitting at this table and fighting for schools to get the funding that they need and all of that. There may be some tangential relationship to lobbying or law work, but you don't necessarily need a JD to do that. So figuring out what it is you want to do, and then working backwards from there to figure out what the credential is that will best help you get there. And so you can be a community advocate without a law degree. It helps to have it in some situations, in some settings, in some circumstances. But what is it you actually want to do? And then then figure out before you invest a lot of, loans or anything else, or even scholarship into an academic path that you may not need to pursue.
I wanted to second something Danetta said earlier about how she feels like sometimes it's her job to discourage people from going to law school. Because I worry that that's how I come off sometimes when I talk, and I want to at least say as background, I'm so grateful that I went to law school. So and most days I would say there's so many reasons to go to law school, because regardless of whether you ever practice law for a day in your life, law school teaches you how to think in a way that nothing else can. There's a level of precision and discipline to your thinking that I think just makes you a better person for the rest of your life in very important ways. So that's an absolute reason to go. The second thing is, I think as a woman, as a female identified person, I think that there's still a fair amount of gender bias and discrimination out there. Mentioning you have a law degree gets people to take notice in a way that other graduate degrees don't necessarily put people immediately on their toes. And I kind of like that in a power dynamic setting. So those are important reasons to go. Getting to know the people you're going to interact with in law school is going to be hugely important. So again, regardless of whether or not you practice, those are all the reasons why you should go. That said, it's $225,000 basically by the time you do your tuition and your living expenses. How are you going to pay for that? So if you're going to a school where you get a very, very generous financial aid package, that might make it more enticing. But a lot of people, like myself, wound up being so strangled in debt that they had to choose a second choice career track in order to pay the debt off. And I find a lot of our students really struggle with that. So looking at schools that have loan forgiveness programs is important because if you have a strong loan forgiveness program, you're going to be able to pursue a broader array of areas. Otherwise, you're essentially tying yourself into 10 years of loan repayments. And that's not something you should do casually. So I agree with Markeisha's point of thinking about what your end goals are and then try to figure out what degrees are required to achieve the end goals. And the best way to do that, I think, here is we've got a terrific alumni association. We have a lot of alums online doing all sorts of interesting things. Find us, through the resources that you have in the career office and reach out to us and say, do I need a law degree to do X or Y? And people are usually very happy to share their stories and talk to you about, the pros and cons of maybe a master's in public health is going to get you where you need to go. And that's only 1 or 2 years. And so that's something to think about. Or maybe the MBA is a better choice. So don't just default into it. You really want to be purposeful. And so I think really understanding what kind of degrees go with the kind of work you want to do in the long term will be very helpful.
Do either of you have advice for people who are considering dual degrees?
You want to start, Ellen?
Sure. This is all about don't default. Don't default into doing a dual degree. When I've done some recruiting for the various schools I've worked for, I find that probably 3/4 of the students I talk to are interested in doing dual degrees. And then in practice, probably 10% of our students wind up doing dual degrees. And so when I'm talking to students, it's usually coming from a sense of, well, I don't really know, so I'm just going to do both. And again, you're talking about a lot of time, a lot of money. If you really are committed to the idea of a dual degree, I think you want to look at schools that really try to integrate the two degrees seamlessly. So for instance, I think Northwestern was the first law school to do a JD MBA in 3 years. Some other schools have now jumped in on that track, but they were sort of the first. So I think you'll see as you look at the dual degree sections of different school websites, how committed the schools really are. A lot of times students will say there's challenges to doing the dual degree because you're never really part of either class at whichever school you're in. So, your friends at the business school are all getting summer jobs at this time and you're looking for a law-related job. But you don't know the people in the law school who are interviewing. So you kind of lose the benefit of the cohorts in both of those schools. So I think looking at how many people in the school are doing dual degrees will give you a sense of how easy it is and how supported it is. Taking a look at how integrated the classes are so that you can actually shave a fair amount of time off the 2 degrees. I think those are very important. But again, I wouldn't do it just because. So people who say, I want to do a JD and a PhD in history, and I say, well, why? Well, I'd like to teach. Well, what do you want to teach? And as they start talking, they really want to teach history. And so you say, well, why the JD or why the history degree? So I think it's, people are so hesitant to narrow down their options. That's always the hardest thing to try to get people to do. But this is one of the tough things about growing up is it's time to narrow down some of your options. So think very purposefully about it. And again, judge the schools based on the information that's available on the website, doing some of the online chats, talking to pre-law advisors, because some schools do this really well and some schools only pay lip service to it.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I would say, to echo what Ellen said earlier, really take advantage of the benefit that you have. And I think Danetta said this too, of this wonderful network of Mount Holyoke alum, right? You have LINC, you have the Career Services Office, or the CDC. There are alums probably all over the world doing something that you want to do. Look at their resumes and CVs on LinkedIn, see what their credentials are, and so, if there is somebody with a JD PhD or a JD MBA, seek them out, call them. How have both degrees benefited you? Going back, looking back, do you need both of them to do what you do today? So I told you at the beginning, I was very interested in African and African American studies and pursuing a PhD in that, and had always wanted to go to law school. I couldn't envision how those two could be bridged. And if I knew then what I know now, I probably would have pursued a JD PhD. I do love history. I do love law, but I would have fancied myself as a Martha Jones or somebody. She wrote Birthright Citizenship a year or so ago, but somebody teaching and writing about the juxtaposition of race law in history, right? I would have had to do much better in law school to be a professor, but that would stand. But I've still had a wonderful life and career with my JD, and I still get to be in those spaces. So was a dual degree necessary? If I wanted to be a professor, yes. But if I wanted that practitioner life, not necessarily. So candid conversations with people in your circle who you trust or have some shared affinity is important.
Great. And I'll jump in opportunistically here and just note for everyone to keep a close eye on the Alumni Association communications in the next 3 to 4 months. We are partnering with the college, in particular the CDC, to launch a new online platform that will help students and alums connect, and alums connect over these sorts of things. And we also have this new alums in law group that we are launching this year, among some other professional groups. So there is going to be some really innovative programming and tools that are coming your way in very short order. So pay attention and do not be shy about reaching out to an alum. Many times we are wondering why more people are not grabbing us. So do not be shy. We love to have people call us up. I know I've ended up writing law school recommendations for an amazing group of young women. So, do not be shy. I'm going to direct this towards Ellen because I think it was part of her experience. What do you see as the pros and cons of taking time off to do something else before law school?
So I'm a big advocate of taking time off. And I think also that's another way that our student population has shifted over the last 25 years. More and more people have taken time off, which makes it a little more like business schools, where traditionally a lot of people came straight through. So the big advantages are one, as I mentioned, the most important thing is really trying to decide if law school is the right thing for you. So I think being out in the work world for a couple of years gives you an exposure and time to think and interact with people so that you're just making a more intelligent decision about whether or not law school is the right thing for you. 2, law school is hard and law school is stressful. And I think if I had made the move after my senior year at Mount Holyoke, which while there was definitely stress and definitely hard work, it was a happy, fun year. And so I think that would have been such a slap in the face to make that move into the first year of law school. Once you've been in the work world, I think there's just certain kinds of discipline in terms of how much time of your day is yours versus not yours, things like that just make it easier to make that transition into a law school environment. So, but in the end, I think the the perspective of having been in the world so that you have a better sense of why this is something you want to do. And also if something goes wrong in a classroom one day and you make a, you give a bad answer, instead of letting that ruin your whole week, as it will for some students, you're able to say, you know what, no clients were affected, no patients were affected, you understand the context that school is really a time for learning and that it really is a time where your stress level should be lower. I think that is another thing you get.
So one thing I definitely want to get to is, many people, when you're thinking about choosing a law school, really focus on the law school rankings when there are so many other things that they should be considering. So what is your advice for people who need to figure out what is really the right fit for them?
Do you want to go?
Yeah.
An elite school is not always the best choice.
That's right. So I went to Mount Holyoke, so I knew that I wanted, enjoyed a small, close-knit, collegial environment, right? That's been how I've had success from high school to college. In law school, Michigan is a bit larger than Cornell, certainly larger than Yale or Chicago even. So, so figuring out size is important. I mentioned that for me, being close to home was important, but I certainly could have gone to, Wayne State or Michigan State or something else and still achieve my goal of practicing in Detroit. So, in hindsight, thinking about the debt that I was taking on, was it worth it? And, there's a lot of data and stats so that many students will accept the higher rank or the prestige, even if it means more debt. And that's something you should look at because it's a very individual determination, but also support, right? And so at Mount Holyoke, even as a school of 2,100 folks, I had extremely supportive faculty, staff, and classmates, and not just my classmates, women in the classes above and coming behind me. I had great relationships with all of them. And so if that's what you enjoy about MHC, and if that's what you're looking for in your law school experience, even though we can't visit law schools right now, reaching out to student ambassadors or to the admissions office to get a sense of the culture and feel of the place, I think is really important. Because what I described as that sink or swim sort of culture, there were other law schools even at that time that would have been more supportive, including the one at which I work right now. So maybe I would have taken a closer look at Cornell if I had been a bit more intentional and deliberate, as we've been talking about this hour. So, the rank in the name, and I'll say as a former Dean of Career Services, the rank and the name are helpful if you want the flexibility to practice anywhere, right? Our law schools where Ellen and I work, where Danetta, our students work all over the country, all over the world. But I was the Dean of Career Services at Detroit Mercy Law School. Many of those students had the opportunity to work in anywhere that they wanted, but their grandparents or their parents had gone to UDM, or they were really committed to a Jesuit education, or they knew they wanted to be in Detroit and that was the best school to go to if you wanted to be a judge someday, right? That was true at the time. So, really assess your goals against not just what's on the website, but what you hear and observe and learn from the people of the place, and all the people, the students, the faculty, and the staff.
I was lucky that when I went to law school, it was right before US News became a thing. So we didn't look at schools in the numerical order that students tend to look at schools now. There was a book on sort of the best law schools, but there were a lot of them, and you really got to pick and choose based on what was important to you. And I wish we could go back to that, because I honestly see students making mistakes all the time in the school that they choose because they're making choice based on ranking. And so I would really try to get you to think outside the rankings box. There's some general benefit to looking at rankings, that you're probably going to have opportunities coming out of a top 20 law school that'll be different from a school that's ranked outside the top 50 or something. But it's not only always the right decision for you. So I think the points that Markeisha made are spot on. Think about national law schools versus local law schools. And roughly, if you look at sort of the top 25, top 40 schools, those tend to be the national schools. So you're drawing students from all over the country, and a lot of students are going to graduate and go all over the country. So for the reasons Markeisha already mentioned, there's advantages to doing that if you want your career to be very portable. If someone came to me and said, I want to work in state government in Massachusetts, I would say you should go to Suffolk Law School, because if you look at who's in state government, who's in the local judgeships, as Markeisha mentioned, Suffolk dominates that region. And walking in with a degree from Harvard Law School isn't necessarily going to connect you to these strong alumni networks that exist. So partly you really do have to think about long term, do I want to be in a particular location? And if so, looking at schools in that location can make a big difference. Two is, if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit in terms of ranking, you might be able to make a lot of money in terms of the financial aid package that's offered to you. We spend a lot of time trying to convince students to turn down full rides from top 10 and top 20 law schools to come to our schools. I don't feel good about that. I actually, when I have those conversations with students, I say, take the money, because honestly, in the end, you're going to have very similar opportunities when you're going out into the world, and doing it with less debt is just going to be so freeing. So don't necessarily choose ranking. Look at the entire package, and I think the money is really going to make a difference as well. Size, as Markeisha said, there's some very giant law schools. University of Texas, Georgetown, and Harvard are sort of three very big schools. A lot of other schools are more in the 200-person range, and that has an enormous difference in terms of the interaction you're going to have with faculty members. So those are the factors that you should really be considering.
Great. Well, I know we're running up against time, so just a couple points of order. I think we haven't even really gotten yet to career services in law school and what you can do after. I think maybe that's a separate panel for another date. So maybe we can take that offline. But I do want people to know that if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat and we will try to answer it. The first one I'm going to take here is, does your major matter in college? The answer usually is no, as long as you learn how to critically think and write and speak and all those wonderful things that Mount Holyoke teaches you to do. But I think when I went to law school, we had people who had majored in everything. I had actors, I had engineers, and everything in between.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's this is where distribution requirements are your friend, because you really do want to be able to show strong analytical skills and strong writing skills. And the students who come with English backgrounds get very upset at the precision of law school. The people that come with science backgrounds get very upset about how much writing there is in law school. And so in the end, having a little bit of both really is a great way to go, but it certainly doesn't make any difference in terms of your application and how it's viewed.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I noticed in law school was my friends who were engineers who had not done a lot of writing were maybe the ones that struggled a little bit. Incredibly bright people. So if you are a STEM major, and I know Mount Holyoke already gives you this, but find opportunities to write.
Do you want me to keep an eye on the chat box and I'll raise the questions? I know we have a hard stop at 1:30, so I want to make sure that we're honoring that timeline. What advice would you give for people who are uncertain about going to law school now? How to find out if you want to do it?
Who wants to jump in?
I'll start. I mean, I think it is a challenge right now, right? I work in beautiful Ithaca. We call it gorgeous there are literally gorges all across the campus, so it really is a beautiful place. But it's hard to know if you want to go to school here until you've had a chance to see it. And our campus is closed. Ithaca is open, but the campus is closed. So I think it's really important to reach out directly to the admissions offices of the schools in which you're interested. Many of them are doing much more virtual programming. Many schools have student ambassadors who are available, who are doing fun things like Facebook Live chats or things like that. And so reaching out to those folks to get a sense of the culture of their place, and if what they're talking about, again, resonates with you and your vision, your goals, your dreams for why you are pursuing law school in the first place.
Another question that arose earlier, what are some alternative paths for those who aren't necessarily interested in litigation?
Ellen, do you
I
want
can
to
maybe jump in here a little bit.
Yeah, great.
So I am a corporate lawyer, so I work in-house. I started at a big law firm in Los Angeles, but very quickly, by year 2 of my career, I had moved into working for corporations. So those are always options. Many people work for nonprofits or for policy organizations or in politics or for the government. There are many options for people who don't see themselves in the courtroom. I never wanted to be in a courtroom. I'm probably going back to me being a little bit of an introvert. It just wasn't what I was interested in doing. I love the idea of helping people structure a complicated transaction, and I love helping people solve problems. So really pay attention to that inner voice that tells you what you like to do. Because some of the law is always going to be difficult, and you're going to have to really comb through a lot of arcane details sometimes to find answers. And very often there is no answer. The answer is not black and white. It is a beautiful, murky shade of gray. And that is why we have lawyers, to help us through the gray. But just know yourself. There are things you need to think about if you want to work in-house. You need to think about ethics. It is a little bit easier in a law firm. If you have a major issue with a client, you need to fire a client because they're doing something illegal. You need to understand that if you're working for a corporation and your vice president is doing something illegal, I've lived through the Enron fiasco. You need to be prepared to walk away from your job, maybe. And that's not something that everyone is comfortable doing. So think about that. To work in-house, I think you have to be very practical. You have to be someone who can live with a lack of perfection. Sometimes you need a quick answer. We say perfect is the enemy of good. Sometimes you're looking for the good enough answer and not the perfect answer. When in a law firm, maybe you could have the time and resources to really seek the perfect answer. So just things to think about, but there are many, 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 many paths for people who do not see themselves in a courtroom.
Markeisha or Ellen, did you want to add to that at all, or should we move on to the next question?
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that
that was
good.
What advice do you have for applicants navigating financial aid?
I would say one thing that wasn't apparent to me that, Mount Holyoke was so generous. I'm a first generation, now my students would call it first gen low income student. I knew I was first gen, and I knew I was low income. We didn't have student orgs or affinity groups by that name at the time. And so I came through at a time when Mount Holyoke was able to be quite generous. But law school admission at the time, while I did get a considerable amount of need-based financial aid, a lot of law school financial aid and scholarship, I guess more so scholarships than financial aid, is dependent on merit. And so merit in terms of LSAT score, and undergrad GPA. And so my advice to folks interested in law school is to do the best you can on that entrance exam, because it will open more possibilities for you in terms of merit-based aid. I also encourage folks to apply for scholarships outside the law school process. So I was fortunate enough to receive several scholarships from local bar associations. And some of my students have received scholarships through writing competitions. They publish in the ABA journal for the section on antitrust or something, and they get a prize with that. And so think broadly beyond just the typical fine aid package, but also know that a lot of the merit aid is, and this varies from school to school based on their resources, but a lot of the merit aid is dependent on the undergrad GPA and the LSAT scores. I took about 6 months off. I finished in December at Holyoke and worked at the Museum of African American History in Detroit. And I wish, before I started in the fall, I wish I had saved up that money and used it for an LSAT prep course.
Thank you. So many great questions coming through. If you have taken several years between college graduation and applying to law school, for example, 5 years or more, is it necessary to have recommendation letters from your college professors?
Yes. And I'm happy to jump in on this since I took 4 years off. So I went back. I thought I should go and see my faculty members in person just to remind them who I was. And I sort of expected to walk into everyone's office and say, hi, my name's Ellen Cosgrove. I graduated, to sort of remind them who I was. I walked into each faculty member's office and they stood up and gave me a hug and said, hi, Ellen. And I was so blown away. And it's not because I wrote the best paper in the class or was the standout student by any stretch. It was, it's literally just the kind of school that Mount Holyoke is. So first you should know, you should do this with some confidence that the relationships between faculty and students at Mount Holyoke are different and they're special, and that's going to help you. But when the admissions office is looking at these letters of recommendation, they want people who are really analyzing your intellectual abilities. That happens with academics. Usually students will provide letters from employers, and they're wonderful, but they tend to talk about, your problem-solving skills, or, how reliable you are and responsible. And those are fine things, but they're not what's going to be dispositive to the application. So you might want to include one current letter from someone who's worked with you in the time since you graduated, but you really do want to focus on academic letters of recommendation. Those are going to be very important. And again, the way I did it was I had copies of my old papers. If faculty members wanted to look at it, I gave them a copy of my resume. I just kind of caught them up so they were able to write something that was relevant. You might also think about, this isn't helpful for someone who's already 5 years out, you might also think about getting letters while you're still a student at Mount Holyoke. And because I believe CDC is still holding letters in a file for people that you could use after graduation if you need to.
Thank you. Do you have specific advice for international students who are applying to law school?
It's much more complicated on the financial front because there's a lot of loans that aren't going to be available to you. So that's something to keep in mind. Don't just assume as you look at all the financial information that that's going to be relevant. There are some jobs that are not going to be available to you. So working for the federal government is usually not an opportunity for students who are not U.S. citizens. The third thing is, there are employers, large law firms, some of whom will be extra excited about you because they have a very global practice and they want people from a variety of countries to be part of their firm. There's other firms that are going to be a little bit afraid that you're just doing this for a year or two before you return to your home country. So you want to be able to make a good case when you're interviewing with employers about your long-term commitment to the organization. But that's another way that law schools have changed tremendously in the last few years. The number of international students has really exploded at most law schools.
Are there some introductory books that you might recommend for those who are interested in the subject of law school?
one, not about law school specifically, but about the work that lawyers do, I guess spoken like a true former dean of career services. The Official Guide to Legal Specialties by, I think it's Lisa Abrams, is always one of my favorites, right? So in terms of being intentional and deliberate and getting a sense of what lawyers actually do in different practice areas and practice settings and practice areas, you know, I mean, like litigation versus corporate practice settings, law firms versus government versus nonprofit. That book gives a pretty good overview of what lawyers in different areas are doing. So if you're interested, and if you're, you know, sort of early on in this path, like way in law school, not quite sure, that's a good place to start, I think.
The book 1L, I think, is sort of a good day-to-day exposure to the psychosis of law students and what it feels like to be a law student. There's also a book called What Can You Do with a Law Degree, which is another way to sort of think outside the box. But if you want to think about sort of legal reasoning and legal theory, there's a book called The Bramble Bush by Carl Llewellyn. And that was required reading before I started law school at Chicago. But I think it gives you an interesting overview of legal theory that might be of interest as you're trying to decide whether or not this is for you.
We're coming close to time. I see a couple more questions, so I'll put those out there and then we can tie things up for today. And I think we're, I don't know, excited about events to come, opportunities to come for more discussion. Would a law school frown on a credit, no credit mark on a transcript if it means a higher GPA?
Markeisha, you look like you had something to say. Do you?
Well, I was the queen of dropping classes, you know, like right up to the point where, you know, I knew the deadlines at Mount Holyoke, so I would take a class and like, I'm not really feeling this particular professor or this particular course, but I would drop it before I would end up with a W or whatever I meant my transcript. So, but I do encourage you to pursue, you know, things that push you and challenge you intellectually, right? And so if you have some pass fails at your disposals or credit, no credit options that allow you to take some risks in an area you wouldn't otherwise explore, I encourage you to do that. I mean, I'm saying this too now from this perspective, or so many of our law schools went to credit, no credit, or pass fail options for the spring because of the transition to online learning with the pandemic. But that said, a transcript that is full of those, that may be a bit problematic. So use them judiciously in areas where, you know, if you're like me, your scar is from high school physics, but there's some really interesting STEM class you want to take. Maybe you save your credit, no credit for that, but aren't using it for everything, or certainly for your major or topics that you profess to have an interest in.
I completely agree about using them judiciously. I will say, and I hate to say this, but I'm going to say this, if you look at law school medians and law school 25th percentile and 75th percentile numbers for GPAs and LSATs, admissions offices live and die based on those numbers. And I hate that. And so having a certain GPA from Mount Holyoke versus a similar GPA from a much less competitive school doesn't necessarily help you. It does in the admissions room when everyone's looking at you as an entire person. But in the end, the admissions people are managing to these numbers. And so if taking a class credit, no credit allows you to bump your GPA up just a little bit, that's actually a good thing in terms of the admissions office view.
Awesome. And then one last one about extracurricular life as a grad student, as a law student. Are there organizations or activities that one can partake in outside of their law school experience? So is it still kind of possible to continue on with hobbies outside of the schooling experience?
Yeah. I'll take a crack at that one. And before I talk about extracurriculars, to Ellen's point, you know, each of our law schools has what we call ABA required disclosures or consumer disclosures. So you can every law school in the country that's accredited by the American Bar Association. You can get a sense of what their student body composition looks like ethnically, and the like. You can see what their incoming credentials are. You can see where their graduates are employed, you know, in broad strokes, academia, private practice, things like that. So take advantage of that information as you navigate the law school application process. The extracurricular life side, you'll have to rely more on another part of the website to explore, which is usually the student life or student services section of the site. And we get to confer quite a bit. There's a National Association of Law Student Affairs Professionals. Ellen and I have both served on the board of that. And so we get to connect with student affairs folks at law schools throughout the country. And law schools are full of extracurricular life. And so we talked a little bit earlier about finding a balance to those extracurricular activities and the things you need to do in the classroom or on your exams or in your final assessment, whatever that might be. Here at Cornell, there's over 40 some student orgs, and for context, we're a law school of 600 JD students. So that's quite a few organizations to manage for such a small student body. And they range from everything from affinity group for sexual orientation or ethnic identity to substantive area of law interest. So things like international law or environmental law and the like. So the other plug I want to put in is that you also want to look at whether or not the law schools you're interested in are standalone. Are they connected to the university? If they are connected to the university, are they located on the same campus as the rest of the university? So here at Cornell, our law students are part of a community of over 20,000 graduate and undergraduate students, but about 7,000 to 9,000 of those at any given time are in the graduate and professional school community. So you can connect with, and there are activities specifically for the graduate and professional school students. So you're meeting up with folks from the business school or from the vet school or from other graduate degree programs. And that may be important to you as well, because the way you socialize after you've had a few years off, or the way you socialize when you're in a professional school and frankly have to indicate to a bar that you are of good character and fitness and haven't had too rowdy of a time is maybe different than we socialized in Pearson.
Thanks so much, Markeisha. Ellen, we have just a couple minutes here. Did you want to add anything in before I kind of share what's coming up next for the association?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with all of that. There's a lot of actually vibrant life, and I would encourage you, as Markeisha said, don't focus just on the admissions section of the website. Keep in mind that most admissions offices pay outside consultants to construct a website to lure you in. So what you really want to do is you want to play around on that website. You want to find the calendar of events, not this semester because nothing's normal right now, but look at the calendar of events, because it's one thing to say we have 50 student organizations. It's another thing for you to look at the calendar and say, well, this school has 5 events a week and this school has 25. So, and these are the kinds of organizations I care about. So everyone's going to sell you on the idea that there's a great life, but you're not going to know about that unless you look at the real activities.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Danetta, Markeisha, Ellen, thank you so much for all the time and thoughtfulness that went into today. And looking forward to future Mount Holyoke Alums in Law events. Again, I just wanted to remind attendees, we do have a survey coming out after this, if you can take a moment to fill that out. In terms of what's coming up for virtual events, I'm going to post a link to the chat box where we're continuing to share out about virtual opportunities. Tomorrow night, we have an M&C with Kajua Saunders McMurtry, who is the VP of Equity and Inclusion at Mount Holyoke. We'd encourage you to join us for that if you're able to, and peek at the calendar of events for what we'll be sharing for the rest of the summer. Thank you all for being with us today. Again, thank you to our panelists, and wishing you all a great rest of the day. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.